Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. This panel is called Transfemininity and Class Mobility. I'm Heather Love. I'm moderating the panel, and our speakers are, I'm just going to introduce them as they're sitting there. It's not the, well, I'll introduce them in the order they're going. So in the middle there is Kadji Amin, who will be giving the first paper. Sorry. And then on the left is Gareth Gavin, who is coming to us from Manchester. Kadji's here from Emory. And on the right is Joan Lubin, who is at Yale University. And I should just say that we've been in conversation for quite a while, thinking about questions of trans and queer identity and class. I think that we really feel that that given the very tight relationship between gender and labor and economic opportunity, that the question of class in transition has been undervalued. And I also just want to mention something that Kadji was just giving a seminar at Penn yesterday, 2 days ago, which was really amazing. But Kadji sort of took us back to a moment when it seemed that trans studies was going to be all about poverty, incarceration, sex work, and asked, I think, the very important question, where has that version of trans studies gone? So just a few opening comments, but we're excited to be here and address these questions, and we're going to start with Kadji Amin. So.
Thanks, Heather, and thanks to the organizers of this conference, especially Matt Brim. I'm very excited to see some different events, including the one at the University of Pennsylvania on queer and class coming together now. When I started doing this work, I thought that I was doing it in isolation, and now it feels like there might be a growing interest in it, and this certainly seems like the political moment for it. So this is very short segment of one of my chapters called Materialist Girls, the Trans-Feminine Career. And with Joan's talk, I think you'll understand more about why I use that term career. Despite the significant class and race differences that separated them, what every trans woman, until the 1980s at least, had in common was that due to the precipitous downward mobility of public transfemininity, the depressed wages of women's employment, and the high cost of genital surgery, transition was, first and foremost, a career crisis. How would she support herself? How would she pay for surgery? Every trans woman faced this question, and every decision made, including remaining closeted or cross-dressing privately, expressed class, race, and sexuality-specific prospects and values. Based on a study of 46 oral histories and related materials, this talk argues that mid-20th century trans women's decisions about public drag, private cross-dressing, and sex change surgery were so inextricable from employment possibilities that they were equivalent to career moves. This talk follows 5 trans women who expressed the race, class, and sexual determinants of some of the most common trans feminine careers of the 1960s and 70s. In an oral history, Ms. Major Griffin Gracie speculates on the reasons for the significant significant differences between Black and white trans girls' trans feminine careers. And this is her. For the Black girls, we came out earlier than everybody else. I don't know if it's the socioeconomic thing at the time or by being Black and we're in a certain economic thing that as a family, we don't get the opportunities that other minorities or groups have. So we're rushed and pushed to this quicker. Once we realize what this is, it's put up with this shit and go crazy or just jump out there and do it. Most of us just jump out there and do it. Most of the Black girls that I know started early, like me, at 15, 14 years old. She continues, for white girls, they didn't have to come out unless they wanted to, because they were going to colleges, they were finding jobs, they were doing other things. They came from money or had money. Here, Ms. Major explains a historically significant demographic divide virtually ignored in trans studies. That between predominantly Black and, I would add, Latina street queens who hit the streets dressed in women's clothing at a very young age, and white cross-dressers and transsexual women who waited to transition until after attending college and obtaining professional jobs as men, or who never transitioned. As Ms. Major explains, in a context of racial capitalism in which Black people had to fight hard for few economic prospects, most Black trans girls realized early on that they had relatively little to lose. So they followed their desires, presenting publicly as women, pursuing sex with men, and changing their bodies through hormones, silicone injections, and minor plastic surgeries, with surprisingly little rumination about the far-reaching consequences of these decisions, and even less introspection about their inner gender identities. The harsh realities of racial capitalism and ongoing discrimination paradoxically freed Black and Latina girls to take more risks, saying yes to their desires to dress like women, transform their bodies, and congregate in public with other queens. As Ms. Major suggests, unlike Black and Latina trans girls, white trans girls would have realized early on that they had quite a lot to lose by giving in to their desires for feminization. They risked missing out on a college education, a foolproof vector of upwards mobility during the mid-century, as well as losing the economic support of their families and the respectability. The gravitational pull of middle-class status on white men in the post-war period was so strong that even some poor and blue-collar white trans girls who would have had less distance to fall toward the street did everything in their power to resist that downward trajectory and make good on the white promise of upward mobility. Denise Den exemplifies this uniquely white ability to resist downward mobility into the street queen way of life. Dan was raised by foster parents until she moved into a near-slum neighborhood in Manhattan, in her own words, at age 11 to live with her working-class birth mother. Despite a difficult childhood, she stubbornly worked her way towards upward mobility. As a white man, she earned a bachelor's degree and worked in a middle-class, white-collar clerical position for 11 years. When I finally permitted myself the luxury of admitting, after all, that I was different, she writes in her unpublished 1969 memoir, Male Facade, I was 26 years old. It would be another 10 years before she actually transitioned. In denying herself the luxury of transitioning until age 36 to secure her middle-class career, Dan exemplifies middle-class trans women's powerful, economically induced capacity to repress and dissociate from their trans feminine desires. Once she did transition, she opted for a transsexual career, given her longing for what she calls a heterosexual type of life. I liked men, she confesses, not as a homosexual, nor as a queen. I did not see a man as a symbol of sexual gratification, but as someone to love, cherish, care for, sacrifice for, make a home with, and share all the pleasures and pain that life together will bring. In short, she is a heterosexual, not just in terms of object choice, but as a lifestyle enjoyed by respectable wives, rooted in domestic security and marital love. I so wanted to be normal, she movingly confesses, confirming Andrea Long-Chu's dictum that, quote, transness requires that we understand, as we never have before, what it means to be attached to a norm, by desire, by habit, by survival, end quote. I would not live in a twilight world, a subculture, she declares, rejecting the transvestite's secret hobby and the street queen's sexual underground. Dan's desire for normalcy is the desire for a secure legal love. It is the desire for partnership and a shared life. It is the fear of being exiled into an illegal underground subculture. And above all, it is the fear of being forced into the despised, impoverished life of the street queen, condemned, as she saw it, to sex without intimacy or love. Dan traveled to Casablanca, Morocco, and paid for vaginoplasty with Dr. Georges Bureau with her own savings from work. Dan's white, middle-class, male salary funded her sex change, and her aspiration for the life of a middle-class housewife led her to choose a transsexual career. Sadly, however, as it did for so many trans women, transition spelled the end of Dan's middle-class life. I was going great guns and was headed into management when I got booted out for you-know-what, she writes. My boss won't even give me a recommendation after spending 11 years with the company. In 1970, she moved to San Francisco, a woman, and began a career as a working-class city employee. She never got a higher-paying job and never achieved her dream of marrying a man. Vaginoplasty could not solve the problem of women's unequal access to the labor market, nor could Dan advertise her college degree or prior work experience without outing herself as a transsexual. Nevertheless, by holding firm against, quote, the luxury of admitting she was different for 36 years, Dan managed to transition while avoiding sex work and the street queen way of life. No small accomplishment during the mid-century. As Ms. Major proposes and Dan exemplifies, as a demographic, white trans women tended to deny or dissociate from their desires in order to enroll in college as men and enter the gender and racially stratified workforce in relatively higher paying men's jobs. While they were busy making a middle-class life, they had ample time to reflect on the disjuncture between their inner feminine desires and their public lives as men. Time to fantasize about and sometimes dress privately as what transvestites called the girl within. Such introspections required space as well as time. Unlike street queens who typically lived on the streets or in overcrowded rentals, as middle-class Americans, untransitioned white trans women enjoyed the amenity of privacy, from private rooms to home ownership. Within these private spaces, they could reflect quietly, developing the sensation of deep psychic space as they engaged in the historically bourgeois practice of introspection. Under these material conditions, they began to experience the private psyche, the intergendered self, and the private home as more authentic than the falseness of the public social male self. For this class of people, the psychiatric jargon of gender identity would have seemed to reference something real, their felt experience of their inner selves as more authentic than their social roles. It is historically significant that heterosexual transvestites were the first to consistently describe their genders as internal through the girl within. They did so because, unlike other trans demographics, they only intermittently gave the girl within embodied as opposed to fantasized and or written expression. They were therefore forced to develop the personality of the girl within through the faculties of the imagination, instead of by simply living and working as her. In short, it was the material conditions of professional class white manhood, education, private space, literacy, and a class standing worth preserving that led heterosexual transvestites to imaginatively develop the personality, tastes, and thoughts of the girl who led a largely separate life inside of their minds. Once they had accumulated enough of an economic base to weather the expenses of medical transition, as well as the bleak labor prospects of transsexual womanhood, they either began dressing as women full-time or medically transitioned. Upper middle-class heterosexual transvestites Virginia Prince and Susanna Valenti exemplify the transvestite career of first marrying a woman and cross-dressing privately, then during retirement cross-dressing full-time without getting vaginoplasty. The major advantage of the transvestite career was that it avoided the downward mobility of transsexual womanhood entirely. By waiting until retirement to live as a woman, a heterosexual crossdresser could live a fully respectable middle-class, and for many, upper middle-class life. Prince's magazine, Transvestia, advised other middle-class transvestites on how to remain respectable and preserve their marriages while discreetly cultivating, through the middle-class practices of reading, writing, and private fantasy, the girl within. With the help of the middle-class amenities of private home ownership, letter writing, magazine reading, and erotic fiction, heterosexual crossdressers developed a unique conceptualization of gendered selfhood that reflected the material basis of their gender practices. That is, they commonly understood themselves to contain two separate and distinct selves, one male and one female, whose relationship they conceptualized as one of gendered economic dependency. Valenti described her male self as brother and provider to her dependent female self. In hindsight, heterosexual transvestites' fluid and doubled understandings of gendered selfhood early espousal and popularization of the medical distinction between sex and gender, and innovation of the idea that one could be a woman, gender, without changing one's genitals, sex, may appear progressive, queer, and even non-binary. However, these conceptual innovations were entirely determined by two material factors: transvestites' ironclad commitment to both their respectable middle to upper class status and their heterosexuality as men. Their gender identities were the product of the material compromises they made to retain their respectability and their income, not the other way around. Val de Prout, a Black working-class New York City trans woman, remarked perceptively, if cuttingly, on the economic strategies of the white trans women she met in transgender support groups of the 1980s. They got money, and there is not one that looked good to me anyway. See, some of these girls do not put money on looks. They put their money in education. Education, that's to get you through. The money will come, so people accept you with that money. Prout's perception of the white middle-class transsexual career, which prioritized getting a college degree and a middle-class job before medically transitioning later in life, was accurate. Her disparaging comments on white trans women's appearances note the effects of their class strategies on their looks. Transitioning later in life meant that they had many more years and even decades of testosterone to overcome than the Black street queens that Prout knew. Moreover, those who had lived as straight men tended to have typically masculine mannerisms, gestures, voices, and speech patterns. By contrast, Prout notes, the Blacks wanted to be real. They were into that real thing. They wanted to be as natural to get by the cops, because if the cops saw you and you was in drag, they arrest you. Without white privilege or middle-class status to protect them, Black street queens relied on their beauty and femininity to pass, stay safe, and make a living in the sex and entertainment economy. The transgender critique of passing privilege since the 1990s erases the fact that beauty and passing have historically been the class strategies of predominantly Black and Latina poor and working class street queens and street transsexuals, as well as that of transsexual women who braved class descent to transition young. Prout stopped attending trans support groups once she realized that the white trans women that monopolized discussion there did not share her material struggles. This was the case despite the fact that, presumably like many of these women, Prout lived a sort of double life to earn a living, working as a man at Doubleday Records. In other ways, however, Prout's career was entirely unlike that of white transsexual women who had done lengthy stunts as heterosexual transvestites. For example, she had been on estrogen since 1965 and went out in drag on nights and weekends to live the gay life with her street queen friends. For Prout, employment as a man was neither a strategy of class mobility nor an effort to symbolically distance herself from street queens through respectability. Not that I think I'm better than anybody, she hastened to add after mentioning that, unlike many of her friends, she did not do sex work. As a working-class Black trans woman, employment as a man would never earn her a middle-class life, much less the money for electrolysis and vaginoplasty. At any rate, Prout's attraction to men would have made private cross-dressing unsatisfying. As a trans woman attracted to men, she was driven to go out and live the gay life in drag, putting respectability out of reach already. The nexus of race and sexuality meant that all male employment could do was keep her housed and fed without having to do sex work for racist white male clients. Prout brings a third factor into the equation of transfeminine class and economic mobility: sexuality. Unlike late transitioning heterosexual transvestites, trans women who were attracted to men, whom doctors considered effeminate homosexuals if they took part in the gay world, had no choice prior to the 1980s but to endure some degree of downward mobility and disreputability. At a minimum, they had to pay visits to the gay underworld in search of sex. There, they would be exposed to both drag and sex work as possible careers for their trans feminine desires. Going to gay bars would have already been a huge risk during a time when sodomy was illegal, gay bars might be raided at any moment, and men risked losing their jobs for having sex with men. Those who took this risk grew familiar with illegality and the underground, making them more likely to take further risks by dressing in drag in public, doing sex work, and falling into the drag queen or street queen ways of life. Or alternately, by pursuing medical transition and transsexual womanhood with their inevitable downward mobility and bank-breaking price tags. Attraction to men was a precipitating factor for downward mobility among trans women, precisely because it disposed those with transfeminine desires to actually live a transfeminine life. This reveals that the contemporary perception of heterosexual trans women as heteronormative and presumably privileged, and of lesbian trans women as queer and presumably oppressed, is a bit wrong-headed, historically speaking. Contemporary queer and transgender culture's disposition against heterosexual, passing transsexual women on the moral grounds of anti-normativity exemplifies how the queer analytic of normativity and anti-normativity is a poor predictor of social and economic privilege. Normative, anti-normative, particularly when articulated through the aesthetic criteria of visible gender nonconformity or the sexual criteria of transgender homosexuality, is often at loggerheads with real economic and social status. This is why I'm writing Transmaterialism Without Gender Identity, my current book, without using the fundamentally misleading analytics of queer, normative, and anti-normative. These analytics have no place in class analysis, which means that they should have no place in trans studies. For trans studies without class analysis merely forwards the elite class interests and class tastes of those of us able to make our trans careers in academia. Thank you.
Thank you, Kadji. Now we're going to have Gareth Gavin, who's coming to us from Manchester. Thanks for traveling all this way, Gareth. We're excited to hear from you.
So my talk is called Change in Class in the Televised Transition of Julia Grant. In an interview accompanying a Radio Times listing of the 1980 BBC documentary A Change of Sex, Julia Grant pitched her televised transition to viewers by invoking a coincidence between sex change and social betterment. "I looked a decidedly working-class boy," she told the paper, "but I'm a much classier woman." The sentiment was echoed in the article's subheading, which promised a story of how Julia had achieved a new life. Taken together, these statements could be said to reanimate, via the unlikely vehicle of Julia's journey across the sexes, a post-war mythos of affluence that aimed to give the working classes a stake in a future which had not yet arrived, and which, by the time of the late 70s, had proved limited and uneven in its real impact at best. The visual machinery of A Change of Sex dramatises the remaking of that collapse myth into the popular individualism that prefigured Thatcher's Britain. While the indefinite article of the documentary's title implies that Julia's transition is one among others, the narrative momentum is supplied by her progress as an individual as she encounters and battles against the London psychiatrist who defines her womanhood as an idea she has about herself, and who, by doing so, withholds the means of transition from her. Subtending this focus, however, is the film's repeated return with Julia to the shores and pubs of Fleetwood, the small fishing port in the north of England where she was from. These images place Julia's changed figure in a labouring landscape that was itself changing due to pressures facing the industry that sustained the town. They draw our attention to a tension that Julia's claim to classiness also expresses. If Julia has succeeded in making herself far too classy to work alongside her dad on a trawler, her transformation also responds to the loss of that prospect as a reliable horizon. Read closely, her claim is not that womanhood has straightforwardly secured her upwards mobility. The suggestion of much classier is double. Transition has also intensified the question of class. It would be tempting to read the Radio Times interview as exemplifying what Aren Azura describes as the need for transsexual subjects to echo dominant discourses of assimilatory desires to be normal and to be productive. Julia also references the story of April Ashley, whose transition took her from the docklands of Liverpool to a marriage to an Eton-educated lord, and goes on to note that she's been busy writing 2 plays and a novel. I argue here, however, that emphasising the sway of dominant discursive constructions over Julia's account of her transformation risks obscuring the ways in which her transition also refracts a story of industrial change and decline, fracturing patterns of life that, even when intact, had already thrown her family and friends into non-normative arrangements born of circumstance. In her later autobiography, Julia describes how, growing up, she assumed all fishermen were bisexual due to the rhythms of their working life, 2 days at home, 3 weeks at sea in male company alone. Her mother, she tells us, took a lover who lived with the family while her father was out on the boats. After the lover himself died at sea, her mother fell into successive periods of alcoholism and gradually moved into sex work to support Julia's many siblings. Julia herself assumed most household roles as eldest child. When she writes that I had replaced dad for all the children and for the young ones I was a mother too, her comment bears comparison to that of a union man. Sorry. Don't know why that's... Sorry, 1 second. Okay, thank you. To that of a union man in a 1973 documentary about Fleetwood called A Life Apart, Anxieties in a Trawling Community. The town's women, he points out, had to do 2 jobs as father and mother to the children. In Fleetwood, this confounding of sex roles, to use a term now superseded by gender, sat inside and was sustained by a sexual division of labour that was strongly customary. My intention here is not to suggest that the conditions of Julia's early life determined her desire to transition. Plenty of her contemporaries responded differently to similar circumstances. Such a suggestion would also seem to summon the long shadow of clinical inquiries into the etiology of transfemininity, a tendency partially present in the manner the psychiatrist in A Change of Sex aggressively questions Julia to locate its cause in some perceived perversion of childhood that actually encodes class assumptions about normal life. The spectre of pathologisation should not necessarily dissuade us, however, from considering the double articulation of Julia's transition as both an encounter with dominant ideas about sexual difference and a response, one among possible others, to a concrete situation that was itself in the process of being restructured by quite specific economic forces. In order to do so, I draw here on discussions of working-class subcultures developed in the same decade as A Change of Sex, the 1970s, by scholars associated with the Birmingham Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies. Many of these thinkers, among them Stuart Hall, had notably absorbed earlier sociological work on deviance, a term that occasionally substitutes for subcultures in a landmark text from 1976, Resistance Through Rituals. While it would be wrong to try and square transfemininity completely with a strict definition of a subculture, which for the authors of Resistance is organised around activities, values, certain uses of material artefacts, territorial spaces, I find useful the suggestion that working class youth subcultures emerge as specific strategies for negotiating contradictions and problems posed for them by a material situated experience that also shapes their class and community as a whole. By differentiating themselves and generating their own patterns and forms, that is, subcultures express, without necessarily resolving, tensions shared with the parent culture, which remains a historical reservoir of inherited customs, comportments, habits, ways. My emphasis in this sense departs from materialist accounts that have primarily looked to trans-feminine communities to consider how, as Emma Heaney has argued, the category of trans woman has a material basis intimately entangled with labour and social relations, a basis that the expert abstraction of trans womanhood into an idea about the self effectively functions to deny. Instead, I want to take seriously a claim made by Julia's mum, in a scene in the first episode of A Change of Sex, and later elaborated by Julia too. Sat in a Fleetwood pub similar to those seen in A Life Apart, wearing tinted shades, acutely aware of the gaze of the respectable institution she's addressing, Jessica Roberts rehearses the possible reasons people might give for her daughter's transition. You think it could be hereditary, it could be the company they've mixed with the wrong people, she says, before immediately countering that diffuse stigmatisation, one that would sweep up both Julia and the world that she's from, by insisting that the wrong people can sometimes, in this case, be the right people. Wrong here condenses into a moralising disqualification the reality of a repertoire of responses, including her own experience of sex work, to strained conditions and routinized hardship, an already tough way of life, increasingly under threat. Julia's mother does not specify that the wrong people are the right people either because they engendered Julia's transfemininity or because they accept it. The statement refuses the logic of both causation and assimilation. What emerges instead is something like an insistence on attitude and intuition as abbreviated theorisations of difficult circumstances and one of the ways in which those circumstances are remade. Julia later rephrases the claim when she visits her sisters in their council flat and compares their response to the way a normal family might have screamed and jumped about. I think their background has prepared them for anything that comes their way, she says. It's important to add that she doesn't idealise their welcome. She also notes that one sister hasn't spoken to her in years, while her autobiography narrates numerous conflicts with her mum. In the time I have left, I want to turn to two scenes from A Change of Sex that help to stage the argument I've been developing here. The first is a sequence in the documentary's third episode where Julia is shown on a single shingle beach walking against a backdrop of open water. The image is initially absent of the suggestion of labour. Julia is a solitary figure in a landscape frequently associated with the romanticisation of adventure. Girls bleat. As she walks along the shore in heels, however, an industrial vessel of some kind comes into view, its paintwork marked and mottled by exposure to high seas. It's not immediately clear where we are. The scene recalls earlier images of Julia walking along Fleetwood's docks, but the location is not definitely confirmed. Nor are we sure whether the boat is still in work. Its hull appears beached. Yet this visual uncertainty indexes conditions actively relevant to Julia's life course. By the time of the late 1970s, a series of cod wars with Iceland had considerably restricted access to fishing waters, severely affecting the distant water fleet of her hometown. Cod was lucrative because non-oily fish is a staple ingredient of fish and chips, what we call in England a chippy tea. The loss of access to Iceland's waters led to many trawlers in Fleetwood being tied up by owners who held out for decommissioning payments from the British government while the fishermen were rendered unemployed, left to seek other kinds of work in a town where most forms of available work were dependent on the fishing industry's success. The next image in the sequence, however, reveals that Julia is not in her northern hometown, but in Brighton, a town on the south coast of England, where she visited a doctor for a private operation, paid for, I think, by the fee that she got for the documentary. The tracking shot is broken by a cut, and we see the boat's bow. The vessel turns out to be a Greek cargo ship, the Athena B, that ran aground in Brighton Beach in January 1980. In the background of the image is Brighton's pier, that symbol of the seaside's other function, leisure and pleasure. By placing Julia's changed figure in a seascape whose relation to labour is uncertain and subject to change, the sequence makes it possible to read the trajectory of Julia's transition as expressing, without being reducible to, experiences and conditions that likewise shape the lives of others who, to borrow a phrase from the authors of Resistance, were not so differentiated. In her autobiography, Just Julia, which was published over a decade later in 1994, Julia describes how, as a child, she had expected to follow her father to sea. On my frequent visits to Dockland, I used to get very excited at the prospect of becoming a fisherman, she says. The only thing that put me off was the smell of the fish. Her grandfather was the manager of the Dockpool office, as had been his father and his father before him. By the early 1990s, however, such prospects were fast disappearing, so that Julia's upfront desire for money, wealth, the good things in life, to quote, drives a break with the shape of a life that was itself breaking. Britain's membership of the European Economic Community in the 80s had led to increased deregulation and the commercialisation of fishing licences, with devastating consequences for employment in Fleetwood. All the old fishermen are on the dole or work on the new industrial estate, a far cry from the open seas, Julia writes. She continues, the old fishermen's pubs have all gone now. The streets seem to be deserted, the soul has gone from the town, the little clubs where girls used to entertain those single men who had money to waste have all closed down. The girls are still there, but business looks bad. Her writerly flair imbues the description with an uncharacteristic whiff of melancholy, but if there is a hint here of nostalgia, a suggestion that everything was harmonious when the girls in the clubs entertained men with money to waste, Julia's subsequent descriptions of her mum's earlier experiences of sex work revise the account. There is only one way for a girl to get money in this hellhole of a town, she cites her mum saying when she was a teenager. Girls here is a signifier freighted with a precarious relation to work for both her mother and for Julia, who also did sex work in Fleetwood. That relation, rather than biology, is its primary meaning. I'll end by briefly mentioning a scene from A Change of Sex where Julia socialises in the kind of pub that she describes as disappearing here. Her mum tells Julia she's in Women's Lib and asks if Julia is too. They sit down with drinks at a table with some of her mum's friends. A woman compliments Julia. Somebody out of shot tells a man to keep your gums to yourself. His gummy smile, a signature of the common custom among northern working class people of having your teeth taken out at 21 to avoid decay and steep dental costs. It would be easy to read this as an instance of heterosexuality serving to secure Julia's femininity, normalising her womanhood. But if there is something of that here, there is simultaneously a form of sociality whose intimacy with both constraint and volatility leads Julia's mum to describe Julia's potential marriage to her boyfriend, Amir, who was an Iraqi refugee, as a question of won freedom, not capitulation to normativity. Normally I would do, the man with the gums meanwhile replies. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Gareth. And our last speaker is Joan Lubin.
All right. Thanks for coming, everybody. Okay, so I'll just dive in. Giving an oral history to Kinsey Institute researchers in 1971, Virginia Prince, who we've already heard about from Kadji just a little bit, described how 11 years earlier in 1960, she launched her magazine Transvestia, a landmark publication for cross-dressers and later, more broadly, trans-feminine people seeking information and community in the post-war US. Asked by the interviewer if it's a solvent project, she replies, quote, "Oh yes, it's solvent. I make a living off of it now. It was never intended for that, but since I sold my regular business about 3 years ago and retired into full-time living as Virginia, that provides the majority of my income. The mail order sales just about pay the cost and pay the girl that helps me, but the commercial sales bring in money enough to pay the rent. A few years later, Prince writes of the effects of selling her so-called regular business, which was a medical manufacturing turned dog grooming product company. She says, "I was then free to live my life as I wanted, having no more domestic or business responsibilities. I therefore crossed the gender line completely and have lived as a woman full-time ever since." She concludes, "I am therefore to be classified as a transgenderist now, and no longer as an FP, her acronym for femophile, her preferred term previously." Prince elaborates on these circumstances in her essay, My Accidental Career. She begins by remarking that, quote, "My white lab coat got me into the medical library, and my education in the fields of sex and gender began." Prince had a PhD in pharmacology, which she had earned while studying and living publicly as a man and cross-dressing in the privacy of her own home. The next decades were spent becoming increasingly public, not only as a member, but also as an arbiter of membership in the cross-dressing and transgender communities, working closely with the sexologists who would come to codify the clinical definitions of transsexuality, transvestism, transgender, and a whole speciated vocabulary of sex and gender that has shaped our contemporary categories. Prince recounts her consultations with various doctors and cross-dressers until she finally heard, quote, "the words that really initiated my career. You must learn to accept yourself as you are." While this statement is notable as a declaration of self-identity, I want to draw our attention to the perhaps less obvious site of semantic density in this statement, Prince's framing of this self-acceptance as the start of her career. It's notable how ubiquitous the term career is in Prince's writing about herself. Her use of the term was one of many instances of her cheeky mobilization of sexological terminology, which she also took quite seriously. The term career, especially in its qualified form, deviant career, rose to prominence in the social theory of the mid-century US and became implicated in the emergence of the discourse of gender identity, of which Prince was a prime architect. I want to pose a question that will organize my thinking here today. What is the relationship between the idea of the career and the identity categories that seem to issue from it for Prince? This is, among other things, a story about the solvency of identity as a neoliberal project of obfuscating material conditions. So in the rest of my talk today, I'm going to track the history of the term deviant career, as it was articulated in occupational sociology and then migrated from the sociology of criminality into the social theory of deviant studies, before being ultimately superseded by the vocabulary of identity. Along the way, the language of the career and the economic relations it conveyed was metaphorized to enable a social theory of deviance which underwrote the emergence of identity as the aspirationally depathologized way we talk about gender and sexuality today. But this conceptual evolution has come at the expense of an explicitly economic terminology that kept gender and sexuality embedded semantically in a sense of the political economy of marginalized social practices. Mid-century Chicago school sociology generated a language of the deviant career to describe things like sex work, gambling, busking, and drug dealing, social practices oriented toward the accumulation of wealth by antisocial means. Over the course of the ensuing decades, social researchers strove to develop a theory to account for the relationships between social structures, contexts, forms, and environments on the one hand, and pathological behaviors manifesting at the scale of the individual on the other. Slowly, the vocabulary of the career was generalized to refer not only to deviant means of income generation, but more broadly to the longitudinal arc of a life, itself characterized as deviant. The career became a fundamentally narratological category, successor to the natural, or competitor to the natural history and case narrative as the favored forms for telling the story of deviant lives. By the time sociologist Irving Goffman would write of the moral career of the mental patient, as he called it in 1959, the ground was laid for the figurative senses of the career to overtake the economic ones, shutting the door on a political economy of the sex, gender, sexuality system that would see it in relation to sex work, in favor of a born this way strategic essentialism or a neoliberal array of elective identities, which in the end may amount to the same thing. Reaching beyond gender studies and its histories, we might link this history up with that other ascendant rhetoric of the career during this heady post-war period, the rise of the corporation, with its men in gray flannel suits negotiating the presentation of self in everyday life, as Goffman would put it in his book by that title. So, how does the concept of the career organize the logic of identity in the American post-war period more generally? It's not necessarily a provincially queer or trans question. It's one feature of the rise of the corporation that careers have become identity defining and even sublimated into identities unto themselves. What is it to be a creative or a founder than to have forged an identity for oneself in the image of entrepreneurialism? Synthesizing these histories, we might consider how identity is in both cases a form of entrepreneurialism of the self. The career became a term of art for occupational sociology in the 1940s, most influentially articulated by Oswald Hall in his 1948 article, The Stages of a Medical Career. Hall proposed that, quote, medicine, like other professions, is practiced in a network of institutions, formal organizations, and informal relationships. The medical career may be conceived as a set of more or less successful adjustments to these, unquote. After outlining a fourfold path of medical professional ascendance, he goes on to say that the stages of a career so conceived are by no means unique to the medical profession. He says, presumably one could investigate similar phenomena in the academic field, in law, in the ministry, in engineering, and so forth. Although the content of each of the above differs substantially, for purposes of analysis, they are fundamentally alike, he says. Hall's presumption proved true, as his framework had prompt uptake and application to most of those careers that he listed, as well as to others as diverse as school teachers, marijuana smokers, jazz musicians, drug addicts, psychiatric patients, sex workers, pedophiles, homosexuals, transvestites, and transsexuals. Riffing on Hall's theory of the career, subsequent Chicago School social theorists would go on to develop the idea of the deviant career. Howard Becker and Irving Goffman, to take perhaps the two most prominent sociologists of deviant careers, both credit Oswald Hall with the genesis of their thinking in this vein. Becker's first attempt at articulating non-normative, though not yet specifically deviant, career trajectories was his 1951 dissertation, which compared Chicago school teachers to the medical professionals Hall had studied, and found that by contrast to the verticality that characterized the doctor's ascent up the professional ladder, school teachers in Chicago tended to have much more horizontal trajectories, moving from one school to another in a similar role, rather than moving up to become, for example, a school principal. Why? The racial segregation of public schools. White teachers would rather take a lateral move to a better, i.e. white school, than move up to a position of higher professional status at a lesser, i.e. black school. Noting the capitulation to prejudice that compelled Chicago school teachers to shift laterally rather than ascend vertically in their professional lives, Becker's modulation of Hall's model laid the groundwork for theorizing all manner of laterally or downwardly mobile trajectories in terms of the career framework. Behaviors that involve transactional relations, but not necessarily professional advancement, drug dealing or drug taking, gambling, hustling, and so forth, became legible as deviant careers. In the trajectory of the career concept toward increasingly figurative applications, Edwin Lemmert's 1951 book, Social Pathology, A Systematic Approach to the Theory of Sociopathic Behavior, is a cornerstone text. It bears the epigraph, "Nothing is good or bad. Only the conception of it and the public reaction makes it so." This describes labeling theory in a nutshell, the idea that calling people deviant is a self-fulfilling prophecy, which would become a cornerstone of social constructivist theory. But it's Lemmert's two-page appendix to this book, suggested outline to be followed in studying and writing the life history of a deviant, that really constitutes an inflection point in the history of the emergence of the deviant career as narrative form, over and above socioeconomic analytic. Lemmert revived a historically conventional framework for apprehending social and sexual difference, the natural history, and updated it for mid-century urban subjects. As a metaphor, the deviant career could make social outsiders legible as participants in a broader social economy, so to speak. As a genre, the deviant career was endowed with the literary capacity to confer believability upon its protagonists. As Earl Rubington put it in his 1967 study of drug addiction as a deviant career, quote, "My purpose here is to stretch the career metaphor to cover the case of the drug addict, and in so doing to make him, as a person, believable and understandable." Rubington goes on to say that, quote, "To become and be a drug addict, a person quite literally has to work at it. This work is not all easy, and in time entails decreasing rewards in proportion to increased efforts." Rubington concludes, quote, "Nevertheless, an addict must follow a sequence of roles in confirming and sustaining his identity as drug addict. Insofar as he does all that, he follows a career, albeit a deviant rather than a legitimate one." Rubington's innovation upon Hall's idea of the medical career comes out in his diction here. What does it mean to have a deviant career as a drug addict? It's tantamount to, as he says, confirming and sustaining his identity. The cleaving off of the career concept from any notion of economics is evident all over the period. Kimberly Kemp, for example, in her article, "Specialization and the Criminal Career," contends that, quote, "The characterization of an individual's criminal activity as a career is not meant to imply that offenders derive their livelihood exclusively or even predominantly from crime. The concept of a criminal career is intended," she writes, "only as a means of structuring the longitudinal sequence of criminal events associated with an individual in a systematic way." The term career here is basically a narrative one, locating a deviant social actor in the cleft between self and society to tell a long-form sequential story of their emergent identity as criminal. Goffman's The Moral Career of the Mental Patient, which I mentioned earlier, described the distinctive affordances of the career concept in its expansive, abstracted form. He writes, "Traditionally, the term career has been reserved for those who expect to enjoy the rises laid out within a respectable profession. The term is coming to be used, however, in a broadened sense to refer to any social strand of any person's course through life. The perspective of natural history is taken. Unique outcomes are neglected in favor of such changes over time as are basic and common to the members of a social category, although occurring independently to each of them." This is still Goffman. It's a long quote. He continues, "Such a career is not a thing that can be brilliant or disappointing. It can no more be a success than a failure. One value of the concept of career is its two-sidedness. One side is linked to internal matters held dearly and closely, such as image of self and felt identity. The other side concerns official position, jural relations, and style of life, and is part of a publicly accessible institutional complex." He concludes, "The concept of career, then, allows one to move back and forth between the personal and the public, between the self and its significant society, without having to rely overly for data upon what the person says he thinks he imagines himself to be." The vocabulary of the career provided a morally neutral language to communicate the mixed personal and social quality of deviance in proto-interactionist terms. This is what Goffman extols as its virtue when he says that this notion allows one to place less stock in what the person says he thinks he imagines himself to be, sidestepping psychological positivism and opening up new analytical possibilities. Esther Newton, in her now classic ethnography of drag performance, Mother Camp from 1972, which started life as a 1968 Chicago anthropology dissertation, in Mother Camp, she offered an astute account of the feedback loop of economic marginalization and social deviance, couched in a description of the corporate culture of American life more broadly. The first chapter, On the Job, opens, "Americans, for the most part, evaluate a man's social status by his occupation. A criminal may be judged a bigger success than a prominent pediatrician if the criminal is richer." Newton goes on to cite Goffman. She says, "As Goffman pointed out, stigmatized groups and categories of persons may be represented by two opposing roles. On the one hand, there's the gentleman deviant, the person who's engaged in proving to himself and others that persons in the stigmatized category can be just as normal and competent as heterosexuals. At the opposite pole, there are the persons who most visibly and flagrantly embody the stigma, drag queens, men who dress and act like women. Professional drag queens are therefore professional homosexuals. They represent the stigma of the gay world." Newton concludes on this basis that female performers are, as she says, an occupational group, and undertakes to study them as such. When Newton writes of the drag performer's deviant career, as she calls it, or in her memoir, My Butch Career, of her own anthropological career and the ways she anticipated her gender nonconformity might disqualify her from it in advance, the sense of the economic remains close at hand. This makes Newton something of an outlier in gender studies, where the uptake of the deviant career concept has, on the whole, been much more abstract. Career is effectively a synonym for lifestyle, whether labor, its compensation are at stake or not. But it's hard to keep the economic entirely out of frame when you're talking about careers. Take, for example, Henry Rubin's more recent Self-Made Men from the early 2000s, which begins its chapter on, quote, transsexual trajectories with Goffman's The Moral Career of the Mental Patient. And he quotes that long quote that I read to you above. He begins by explaining, Rubin that is, begins by explaining that the concept of the trajectory is adapted from Goffman's sense of the career. No doubt Goffman's sense of the career is subtending Rubin's discussion of trans men who have or have not had what Rubin calls lesbian careers prior to transition. It's less clear that this sense of the career is operative when he describes how some of his transmasculine informants' dissatisfaction with quote-unquote careers available to women compelled them to expedite their medical transitions to become eligible for jobs available to men. We have shades of the historical brink between identitarian and economic careers again here, as these two senses of the career are brought together in uneasy catachresis. We find perhaps the apotheosis of the deviant career theorized by sociologist J. David Brown. In his article, The Professional X, an alternative for exiting the deviant career, he writes, preliminary analysis suggests that professionalizing rather than abandoning a deviant identity facilitates exiting deviance. It might include adoption of a legitimate career premised upon an identity that embraces one's deviant history. Brown's article was published in 1991, coincident with the emergence of academic queer theory in its institutional, or we might say, professional form. The entire field formation of queer theory might be described as exiting deviance by way of professionalizing rather than abandoning a deviant identity. This, I would propose, is one way of accounting for the occlusion of class analysis in so much of the field. The vocabulary of career then fused moral judgment, economic prospects, and narrative form into a ground plan for emergent queer and trans identities, which smuggle their economic logics silently stowed in their DNA. It's not called a deviant career anymore, but it doesn't really have to be. The career and the deviance in equal measure have been sublimated into the very substance of identity. To revive a dynamic sense of the political economy of the sex, gender, sexuality matrix requires divesting narrative meaning from the idea of the deviant career so that it can function not as individuating mechanism of pathologizing protagonization. They're quite entrancing, these stories of deviant careers, but as a way of lighting up the economic relations of dependency that subtend the solvency of identity. To return to Virginia Prince in closing, her retirement into gender identity required the financial support of an entire community of trans feminine identification rendered as a readership, but perhaps more significantly as a market who could pay her rent. But the solvency of identity remains in tension with the force of desire as solvent. I recall a line from Eve Sedgwick's Epistemology of the Closet, where she says, sexual desire is an unpredictably powerful solvent of stable identities, which reminds us that solvency doesn't mean lucrative, but actually liquid. The modern subject and its identitarian career of definition by exclusion emerged as one effect of a historical conjuncture, rather than an absolute premise through which all histories of sexuality must pass. Telling a history of queer class relations requires conjuring the encounter between identity and precarity as a site of collective struggle, taking identity seriously as a historical and rhetorical effect and counter-revolutionary compensation rather than a premise of solidarity politics. Thanks.
Yeah, these guys. Okay, so we have about 15 minutes, and I think we need it. So please, I invite you to the mic, and Derba, you're first. Yep, go ahead.
I just, first of all, thank you so much. What a phenomenal and coherent panel, actually, in really, really interesting and provocative ways, in ways that I'd like to hear you all talk to each other. Okay, I'm going to read my question. I wonder if you all might address further the specificity of transfemininity in the conversation that was just had, especially in thinking about the through line of the concept of career, the category of career. And obviously this last paper was a beautiful invocation and thinking about that concept itself. And you know, one thing that was most striking to me, and I can't help but think about, like, what is the form of social science that's emerging in the post-war period, is the way that the rise of economic life more broadly becomes the primary way through which the social world is being understood, or social life is being studied, particularly from the 1950s on. And I can't help but think about the same moment of labor that you're describing, particularly in post-war Chicago-style sociology, for example, Chicago School, is when there is another kind of new laboring market, which is named something else, which the new laboring market of so-called cis women or women, which is conceptualized as informal labor. So it's a very different category than the category of career. And where informality, to me, I link to obviously parts of the world where people are doing certain kinds of informal labor, so many, many parts of the third world in this moment in the 60s and 70s, and then women of color, Black women, Latinx women. And so I was thinking about that particularly because even from the beginning, Kadji, when you started to use the word career, what was so striking is the way that your subjects were negating the category, you know, as you described, where the Black transsexual is excluded from higher education and excluded from being able to narrativize themselves through the question of professionalization. And so in some ways, the category of career didn't seem, in some ways, it's like by calling it career, you are in some ways subverting the category even as you're using it. But it's such a racialized category that I wondered if you could address that and then also address what is specific about transfemininity as we think about these questions. Thanks so much.
Yes, this is working. Thank you, Derba. That's a great question. I'll just offer a small piece of it, which is, I think, for me anyway, my interest in transfemininity is less categorical and more historically specific insofar as Virginia Prince played a very particular role in the development of those vocabularies and concepts and categories. And I think it's, I think the way that, you know, the Esther Newton moment of citing Goffman and calling drag queens the professional homosexuals because they're the stigma bearers, I think there's a through line to be considered around how transfemininity is a stigma bearer in the category of neoliberal identities now, in a way that sort of brings the Virginia Prince case study into a more fulsome kind of implicatedness in the conceptual landscape. But the reason that I start with her has less to do with her being a instance of transfeminine historical existence and more to do with the ways that she had a very particular class investment and stake in her own respectability that compelled her to proliferate gender categories that would insulate her from the stain of sexual perversion. So she develops the idea of transgender to differentiate from transsexual, which is affiliated with survival sex work and all kinds of other, and paraphilias and things that she doesn't want to have sort of hanging over this project that she's engaged in.
Thank you, Deborah. That's an amazing question, as usual, from you, and it really has me thinking. So to answer the transfemininity bit first, in my book, I talk both about transfemininity and transmasculinity, but I talk a lot more about transfemininity, and I think that that transfemininity in the United States rather the formation of different groups of trans feminine ways of life, it's quite striking, from the mid-20th century all the way through the end of the 20th century, how much they were structured entirely, by race, class, and sexuality, right? Such that they were, so for instance, the categories of cross-dresser and queen were separated from one another by an enormous class gulf and an enormous gulf in terms of social cultures. Like, they usually never encountered each other. If they did, it was in the context of cross-dressers paying queens for sex work or entertainment work, right? So as clients. And so it really has been helpful for me for thinking about the material determinants, right, and the material conditions of trans cultures, and unmasking what Joan talks about as the way that neoliberal identity disappears or occludes, right, the material conditions of it, right? Trans masculinity, in a way, is much simpler, right? And so I have a chapter on passing men, by which I mean female-bodied people who passed and lived as men from the late 16th century all the way into the 1990s, right? And this was such a more possible way of life than the different trans feminine forms of life, right? It was relatively easy. It was fairly lucrative, right? And this was so much the case that in the early modern period, and in the United States all the way into the 19th century, the understanding was when these passing men would get caught, right, that, oh, they were doing something unusual, which is usually not a good thing, and they fooled people, which is usually a bad thing. However, they did so to fulfill important economic and patriotic roles that usually women would be completely incapable of. So actually, this is a pretty, it's either an amazing thing, an exemplary thing, or it's something that we can just not worry about and not really punish, right? So passing manhood continued to be a very viable way of life, and as such, it tended to be mainly working class. But there were also, because middle-class passing men required the assent of their families, right? And education, sometimes required family support as well. But the result is that for passing men, class differentiation is not so strong, right, as in the different careers of trans feminine women, right? So anyway, I'll stop there with that question. But for the question, I love what you said about the career as such a white form, right? And as something that informal labor and illegal labor is not traditionally understood as a career. So that, it does give me pause in terms of my use of that term. But I think that it describes, even the thinking of drag queens in the mid-century and street queens as well, right? And certainly the terminology, right? A lot of street queens, and I use that term to differentiate them from drag queens, a lot of street queens simply called themselves drag queens, right? And so I think that term and the coincidence between a professional job, right, if not a career as a drag queen, and an identity category of largely unemployed or illegally employed people, right, is very interesting and demonstrates the extent to which the socioeconomic was completely inextricable from a kind of group identity based in lifestyle, but also the way that maybe the dominance of the corporation in the mid-20th century also influenced how people at the very bottom of the class structure were thinking of themselves, right? Or even trying to kind of rehabilitate themselves. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think, so yeah, also for me, like this is something that I'm working on alongside a creative project that is thinking about trans masculinity and the sort of the longer history of a protagonist's masculinity in relationship to industrial change and the kinds of comportments, habits, attitudes that kind of are available. And so I've kind of come to this to kind of think about things in different ways, but also alongside that. But I think there is something important about the specificity of transfemininity for sure here. Like one of the things that kind of I didn't talk about, because it's often what gets focused on about the documentary, although there isn't kind of much on this, is the kind of encounter with the psychiatrist who tries to kind of translate Julia into kind of a sort of set of middle-class expectations about femininity. So her stubbornness, her forcefulness, her determination are all things that he kind of like disqualifies and sort of sees as kind of making her sort of unsuitable for transition. But actually, when you kind of look at her kind of context and community, kind of you see how much those are class assumptions about how a woman would be. So there's something specific about that as well.
Thank you. Are there other questions? Yeah, please.
Yeah, I'd just like to ask about an anecdote regarding Virginia Prince that I don't think any of you brought up. This is just, I'm reading from Susan Stryker's Transgender History. And that is her 1959 or 1960 prosecution for male obscenity, or MAIL, that's to be clear. I guess I'll just read this. In late 1959, a little event with big implications for transgender political history started to unfold in Los Angeles when Virginia Prince pursued a friend's suggestion that she begin a personal correspondence with an individual on the East Coast. This third person, who self-represented as a lesbian, had expressed a desire to, through their mutual acquaintance, to be put in written contact with Prince. Prince subsequently received a photograph from her East Coast correspondent, who neither she nor her friend had ever met face-to-face, of two women being sexual with one another, which bore the caption, "Me and You." Prince's correspondent invited her to ask anything, and as the intimacy of the correspondence deepened, Prince sent a letter describing a lesbian sexual fantasy involving the two of them. Prince's correspondent, it soon turned out, was another male cross-dresser, one who happened to be under surveillance by the federal postal authorities for soliciting and receiving obscene materials. And I guess you just mentioned in your historicity of white upper-class trans identity, the importance of cross-dressing as a kind of queer privacy. And given when Virginia Prince was eventually prosecuted for what was at least described privately as lesbianism, do you think there's any tensions there between this kind of outing as a potential what can be read as a potentially, trans-lesbian relationship? And do you find anywhere in the archive, I mean, there certainly are examples that can come to mind of, early white out trans lesbians. Beth Elliott comes to mind. But then also given, this is specifically you, Kadji, you mentioned how trans feminine identity among the so-called street queens, that pursuing heterosexuality was a way of finding authentic womanhood. And then do you find a archive of trans feminine individuals claiming lesbian identity in public of color? And if there's some sort of absences there, like, do you have any ideas of how that relates to this broader conversation about public and private?
Yeah, great. Is this on? Great question. No, there's no articulation of trans lesbianism until I believe the 1980s. And that's through the upper class group of cross-dressers, which had now been organizing since the 60s into a community through the influence of Virginia Prince. And they then, around that time, start rethinking the traditional idea that transvestites are heterosexuals. Some of them start rethinking that as lesbianism, right? But before that, so I have a longer chapter on Virginia Prince in which I do discuss that letter scandal. And part of what happened was So in a lot of cross-dresser writing, and there was a lot of like epistolary exchanges, and there was a lot of erotic literature, right? You do see a lot of explicitly lesbian fantasies, right? Nonetheless, in the public culture led by transvestia, right, there's an insistence, and Virginia Prince is really at the helm of this, that all of this fantasy and all of their attraction to women is a certification that they're normal heterosexual men, right? So there's not only, so the clinging to the category of heterosexuality is part of the clinging to the category of being a normal man, right? And this is during an extremely homophobic mid-century period, right? Where homosexuality, male homosexuality in particular, is a marker of deviance and a cause of people losing their jobs, right? So there's an economics to this rejection of homosexuality as well. At the same time, Virginia Prince was incredibly homophobic, right? And what this letter scandal, part of what they were accusing her of was of actually being a homosexual, which is to say not a lesbian, but a male homosexual, right? And so she strenuously rejected this. And in fact, this influenced her to create the whole ideology of transvestia that insisted that transvestites were heterosexual in order to reject this charge of homosexuality that had been publicly levied against her, right? And I interpret the entirety of her intellectual output as animated by this class-based distaste for homosexuality, especially as incarnated by the figure of the queen, right? She wanted, over and over again, she tries to separate the transvestite from the queen. She created all of her sororities, had a structure so that queens could not become a part of them, right? Part of which was through very high fees, right, which queens would not be able to pay. And she never ceased guarding against this infiltration by quote-unquote homosexuals, who are who the queens were by virtue of being attracted to men, right? So this is economic, right? It's about class and status. And that's where the rejection of lesbianism comes from, right? Or the inability to articulate or think lesbianism, even though a good many of these fantasies are lesbians. There's this anecdote late in life when she's traveling around the world in her retirement as a woman, right? She's been living as a woman. She meets a lovely, non-trans woman at some transvestite event that some Europeans have thrown for her. Unfortunately for her, in a gay bar, right? And so, of course, she will not stay inside the gay bar. She leaves the gay bar to stand outside and talk to this woman. And she notes how she sees a queen, or someone she understands as a queen, leaving with a man that she picked up in the gay bar while she's making out with the new woman who she just met. And her reading of this scene is that I was right all along. We heterosexuals are so different from those homosexuals, right? So, even late in life when she was living as a woman, going by the name Virginia, and so on, she continued thinking of herself as heterosexual.
Can I just add one thing? Just one other wrinkle added to the anecdote that you've just shared about the letter scandal is that she didn't end up serving time for that crime. She worked out, this is also a function of her class privilege, she had a lawyer, right? She worked out a plea deal where she would be on probation rather than serving time. And one of the conditions of her probation, of course, is that you don't break any additional laws. And so cross-dressing would have been her doing more criminal activity. So it was written in that she could continue cross-dressing to the extent that it was to educate the public about cross-dressing. So that actually launched, quite materially, launched her career as a kind of public spokesperson of transvestism and sort of, by extension, transgender, as her thinking about that develops.
Guys, we have to wrap up. I just want to say how much I admire the work that you three are doing, and I think just the intellectual curiosity and the political commitment is palpable in the room, and the kinds of methodological work that this has taken you into, Birmingham School, Chicago School, all of this archival work, all of this work with social science, which is not really your training, and I just want to say how much I appreciate this amazing work. So thank the panelists, please.